They tell you that you are free, yet every hour of your waking life is already sold. They tell you that society is neutral, that the market is natural, that inequality is unfortunate but inevitable. And still you running to work, running from debt, running towards survival too, exhausted to ask the most dangerous question of all: who benefits from this order? And why must you remain too busy to understand it? The world does not need you ignorant. Ignorance can be cured. It needs you occupied, fragmented, and distracted, because a conscious worker is a threat to every structure built on exploitation. Capital does not rule by chains alone. It rules by time, by necessity, by the quiet coercion of hunger and insecurity. You are not forced to labor at gunpoint. You are forced by rent, by bills, by the fear of falling into misery. This is not freedom, it is compulsion disguised as choice. Under capitalism, labor is reduced to a commodity, bought at the lowest possible price, and consumed until exhaustion. Your creative power, your intelligence, your very life force are extracted and transformed into profit for a class that does not work, yet owns everything. The more you produce, the poorer you become in spirit and security, while wealth accumulates in fewer hands. This is not an accident of the system. It is the system functioning exactly as designed. To maintain this order, consciousness must be suppressed. You are trained to see yourself as an individual competitor rather than a member of a collective class. You are told that success is personal and failure is your fault. The worker who rises is celebrated. The millions who fall are blamed. In this way, capitalism divides you from your fellow laborers, turning solidarity into suspicion and unity into rivalry. A divided class never questions the foundation of its own exploitation. Ideology becomes the invisible guard of the ruling class. Schools train obedience before understanding. Media sells distraction as leisure. Politics offers you choices that never threaten ownership itself. You are permitted to argue about personalities, cultures, and symbols, but never about who controls production, who owns the land, who commands labor. The most radical truth that society is organized around class domination is buried beneath endless noise. Busyness is the modern form of repression. When every moment is consumed by survival, reflection becomes a luxury. When exhaustion defines daily life, resistance feels impossible. This is why insecurity is preserved, not eliminated. A worker worried about tomorrow cannot organize for the future. Precarity is not a failure of capitalism. It is one of its most effective tools. Yet history does not move by illusion forever. Every system contains the seeds of its own undoing. Capitalism, in concentrating workers, standardizing labor, and exposing its contradictions, creates the very force capable of overthrowing it. The working class is not merely a victim of history. It is its engine. When workers recognize that their shared condition is not personal misfortune, but collective exploitation, consciousness emerges, and with it, power. Class consciousness transforms isolation into solidarity. It reveals that the wealth of society is produced collectively and stolen privately. It unmasks the lie that the ruling class is necessary, when in reality it contributes nothing but control. Once workers understand that they are the creators of all value, the moral authority of the oppressor collapses. But consciousness alone is not enough. Ideas must take material form through organization. Unions, movements, and collective struggle are not relics of the past. They are the means by which history advances. Rights were never gifted by benevolent elites. They were seized by organized masses who refused to remain silent. Every gain the working class has ever made came from confrontation with power, not compromise with exploitation. The ruling class fears many things, but nothing more than an organized, conscious proletariat, not because it is violent, but because it is legitimate, because it exposes the irrationality of a system where abundance exists alongside deprivation, where technology advances yet human life remains insecure. A system that cannot justify itself must rely on force, ideology, and distraction to survive. The task before you is not to work harder, adapt faster, or dream smaller. It is to awaken, to see your condition clearly, and to recognize yourself in others. To reject the lie that this world is the best that can be achieved. Another society is not only possible, it's necessary. A society where production serves human need, not private profit, where labor is dignified, not exploited, where freedom is material, not rhetorical. The world needs you busy because consciousness changes everything. When workers stop running and start understanding, history shifts. When they organize, power trembles. And when they act collectively, the old world built on your exhaustion begins inevitably to collapse. The world we inhabit is structured not by accident but by design. At the core of this design is a relentless demand for busyness. From the moment a worker awakens, their day is regimented to serve the needs of production, consumption, and survival, leaving scarcely any space for reflection, analysis, or critical thought. Capitalism requires that the laboring masses remain in constant motion, occupied with tasks that appear urgent, but ultimately serve the interests of the ruling class. Busyness is not neutral. It is a deliberate mechanism of control, engineered to suppress consciousness and prevent the realization of collective oppression. In a society where time is money and every hour is monetized, the worker becomes a machine responding to schedules, quotas, and deadlines, their mental and emotional energies drained in the process. This exhaustion is not incidental, it is a strategy. When a worker is overextended, their attention is absorbed by immediate concerns: rent, bills, childcare, transportation, and the endless demands of employment, leaving no capacity for questioning the systems that produce their subjugation. Every distraction, every minor task, every moment of forced labor acts as a barrier between the worker and the awareness of their own exploitation. Consciousness, the recognition of one's condition as part of a larger class structure, requires space and energy to develop, yet busyness systematically erodes both. The ruling class understands that a tired, preoccupied proletariat is a compliant proletariat. Ideology reinforces this by normalizing the endless workday, glorifying productivity as a moral virtue, and framing inactivity or reflection as laziness or failure. Cultural narratives insist that those who cannot keep pace are insufficient, morally weak, or personally flawed, diverting attention from systemic inequities to individual shortcomings. In this way, busyness functions as both a material and psychological barrier. Workers are compelled to labor under the illusion of freedom, believing that their schedules are chosen and their responsibility self-directed, when in reality every obligation is dictated by the imperatives of a system that profits from their toil. Even the spaces of rest are contaminated by expectation. Leisure is often repurposed as preparation for work. Entertainment is commodified, and personal time is structured by the rhythms of consumption, social media, and performative engagement. The cumulative effect is profound. The worker is physically present in life but mentally and spiritually preoccupied, a state in which awareness of social conditions, economic exploitation, and political structures cannot take root. Furthermore, busyness undermines solidarity among workers. When individuals are consumed by their own survival, they are less likely to interact meaningfully with others who share their plight. Isolation becomes the natural condition of labor under capitalism, as communal bonds are frayed by time scarcity and fatigue. Class consciousness, which depends on recognizing shared conditions and developing collective identity, is therefore systematically delayed or diverted. Work becomes an instrument not only of production, but of ideological containment. The repetitive nature of labor, the relentless pace, and the fragmentation of tasks serve to compartmentalize experience, making it difficult to perceive the connections between one's individual suffering and the broader structures of inequality. The constant pressure to be busy cultivates acceptance of the status quo. A worker who cannot even contemplate alternative arrangements is unlikely to challenge existing hierarchies. Education and critical thought are similarly affected. Intellectual engagement requires time, reflection, and focus, yet busyness constrains all three. Opportunities to read, to debate, to theorize, or to analyze are sacrificed for the imperatives of immediate survival. Knowledge becomes practical rather than philosophical, instrumental rather than emancipatory, reinforcing the cycles of compliance that capitalism depends upon. Even activism and dissent are affected. Those who might resist are often too exhausted to organize, too overcommitted to plan, and too distracted to sustain long-term engagement. Busyness is thus a preemptive strike against revolution, a tool that ensures that the consciousness necessary for collective action cannot emerge naturally. In historical terms, every movement that has sought to challenge the ruling class has faced the obstacle of preoccupation. The more the masses are kept busy with immediate pressures, the harder it becomes to cultivate a vision of systemic change. Capitalism exploits not only labor but time itself, converting every moment into potential profit and every hour into a reinforcement of compliance. The psychological weight of perpetual busyness, combined with the structural demands of labor, produces a population that is technically free yet practically captive, theoretically sovereign yet functionally constrained. In this way, busyness is a form of repression, subtle yet pervasive, shaping consciousness without visible chains, controlling behavior without coercion, and maintaining hierarchy not through force alone but through the deliberate management of attention, energy, and temporal resources. By occupying the body and scattering the mind, busyness prevents workers from perceiving the unity of their conditions, the inevitability of exploitation under private ownership of the means of production, and the power inherent in their collective potential. It ensures that reflection, solidarity, and revolutionary imagination are postponed indefinitely, rendering the masses effective producers of value, but ineffective agents of change. Every task assigned, every hour demanded, every distraction introduced is a calculated intervention to suppress class awareness, to inhibit the formation of networks of resistance, and to maintain the existing order in perpetuity. The more the system can ensure that workers remain busy, the more secure the dominance of the ruling class, and the more distant the possibility of conscious, organized challenge becomes. Under capitalism, labor is not merely work, it is transformed into a commodity, a measurable unit of value that can be bought and sold in a market dictated by profit rather than human need. The worker, life, skill, and effort are converted into an object to be exchanged, and the very act of labor becomes a transaction rather than a form of human expression or fulfillment. In this system, the worker does not own the fruits of their labor, nor do they participate in deciding how their labor contributes to society. Instead, the product of their effort is appropriated by the capitalist, who pays the worker less than the value created. This discrepancy is known as surplus value, the foundation of exploitation. Surplus value is extracted systematically. The capitalist purchases the labor power of the worker at a price that sustains their basic existence, but does not reflect the full worth of what they produce. Every hour the worker spends in toil generates wealth far exceeding their compensation, a difference that is captured and accumulated by the owning class. It is not incidental that this extraction exists. It is the engine of the capitalist system. The more the worker produces, the greater the profit realized by the capitalist. Yet the worker remains confined to a fixed wage that allows survival, but not accumulation or autonomy. This process reduces human labor to an instrument of capital accumulation, stripping away the dignity of the worker, and converting creative and physical energy into pure monetary gain for those who own the means of production. Labor under capitalism is alienated in multiple dimensions. The worker is alienated from the product of their work, as they cannot claim ownership or control over what they create. They are alienated from the process of production itself, performing repetitive or dictate tasks that offer no autonomy, no sense of self-expression, and no fulfillment. They are alienated from their fellow workers, competing in the market rather than collaborating as equals, and they are alienated from their own humanity, as their creative potential is subordinated to the imperatives of profit rather than social need. This alienation is not a side effect. It is a necessary condition for surplus value to exist. For surplus value to be extracted, labor must be controlled, regimented, and isolated from the outcomes of its own exertion. Capitalists purchase labor power as a commodity precisely because it can be controlled and directed to generate more value than it costs. Every innovation, every technological advancement, and every system of organization in the workplace is designed to maximize the efficiency of labor and the extraction of surplus value. The worker becomes a tool, a resource to be managed, measured, and optimized for profit rather than an individual whose needs and aspirations are considered. Surplus value can manifest in multiple forms. In simple terms, it is the unpaid labor embedded in goods and services, the difference between what the worker is paid and what the product sells for. In more complex forms, it emerges through the intensification of work, the extension of the working day, the imposition of stricter productivity targets, or the mechanization of tasks to extract greater output from less human effort. All of these mechanisms are intended to ensure that labor produces more than it receives in return, reinforcing the accumulation of wealth by the capitalist class and deepening the structural inequality between laborers and owners. Capitalism not only commodifies labor but also naturalizes this exploitation through ideology. The wage system is presented as fair compensation. Markets are framed as neutral arbiters of value, and inequality is justified as a reward for skill, effort, or talent. Workers are encouraged to believe that their position reflects merit rather than systemic extraction. This ideological framing obscures the reality of surplus value, making exploitation appear voluntary, inevitable, or even desirable. The more a worker internalizes this ideology, the less likely they are to recognize their collective power and the structural forces that shape their existence. Historical development of capitalism has intensified the extraction of surplus value. In pre-industrial societies, labor was often tied directly to subsistence and local production, limiting the capacity of any single owner to accumulate vast wealth. Under industrial capitalism, mass production, division of labor, and mechanization multiplied the potential for surplus extraction. The factory system regimented workers' time and standardized production, allowing capitalists to extract not only more work, but also greater precision and control over the labor process. In modern times, globalization, digital technology, and financialization have expanded these possibilities even further, enabling the extraction of surplus value on a global scale from millions of workers dispersed across borders, while the owners of capital reap the majority of the benefits. The social consequences of this commodification are profound. Workers experience material deprivation, limited autonomy, and alienation, while society as a whole becomes structured around the imperatives of profit rather than collective well-being. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands, economic inequality deepens, and the majority are compelled to sell their labor to survive. The extraction of surplus value is therefore not merely an economic transaction, it is a social relation that shapes the structure of society, the consciousness of workers, and the distribution of power. Resistance to this exploitation has historically taken many forms, from labor strikes to unionization to revolutionary movement, all aiming to reclaim the value stolen from workers and to challenge the legitimacy of a system that commodifies human life. Recognition of surplus value is the first step toward class consciousness, as it reveals the structural exploitation embedded in everyday labor and exposes the fundamental contradiction of capitalism. Those who produce wealth are denied its control, while those who own the means of production accumulate it without laboring. This contradiction is the engine of social conflict, and understanding it is essential for any movement seeking to dismantle exploitation and create a society in which labor serves human need rather than private profit. The dominance of the ruling class is not maintained solely through coercion or force. These are crude tools that can only achieve compliance temporarily. The deeper, more effective mechanisms of control operate through ideology and distraction, shaping the way people perceive the world, their place within it, and the very possibilities they can imagine. Under capitalism, ideology functions as an invisible architecture of consent, teaching the oppressed to accept their condition as natural, inevitable, and even just. From childhood, individuals are socialized to internalize the values, assumptions, and norms that reinforce existing hierarchies. Schools inculcate obedience, punctuality, and competition, presenting the accumulation of credentials as personal achievement rather than as preparation for exploitation within the labor market. Media, in its myriad forms, saturates daily life with images, narratives, and symbols that glorify wealth, normalize inequality, and obscure the structural causes of suffering. Entertainment encourages passive consumption, offering distraction while masking the conditions of production, while political rhetoric frames systemic problems as the failures of individuals rather than the consequence of a social order structured for the benefit of the few. Ideology operates not by overt compulsion but by shaping consciousness, convincing people that their struggles are personal, their ambitions limited, and their consent voluntary. Distraction amplifies the power of ideology by occupying the attention of the mass with trivialities, spectacles, and crises of appearance rather than substance. In a society structured around busyness, survival, and constant stimulation, individuals are kept in a state of mental overextension, too preoccupied to analyze the social forces that govern their lives. Work, social media, consumerism, entertainment, and the endless swirl of immediate concerns ensure that the majority remain spectators of their own oppression rather than actors capable of systemic critique. The ruling class understands that a population constantly entertained or overwhelmed is less likely to cultivate the reflective awareness necessary to challenge authority. Ideology and distraction also operate through the creation of false divisions among the oppressed, fragmenting potential solidarity and obscuring the reality of shared exploitation. People are taught to identify themselves according to race, gender, nationality, or ideology, emphasizing differences while ignoring the material conditions that bind them together. Competition, envy, and suspicion are cultivated as natural, even virtuous, while collective consciousness and organized resistance are presented as unrealistic or dangerous. By directing attention away from systemic exploitation, the ruling class ensures that the workers remain disunited, isolated, and less capable of recognizing the power inherent in their collective labor. Religion, patriotism, and cultural narratives serve a similar function, framing obedience and submission as moral or sacred obligation. The worker who is immersed in belief systems that glorify sacrifice, discipline, or national loyalty may fail to recognize that these ideals are deployed to legitimize economic exploitation and social hierarchy. Ideology not only explains the world in ways favorable to the ruling class, but also discourages questions that might destabilize the social order. Meanwhile, distraction fills the cognitive and emotional space necessary for critical thought, providing temporary relief from suffering while ensuring that no long-term perspective develops. Even awareness of exploitation can be neutralized by distraction. Intellectual engagement, political discussion, and exposure to critical ideas require sustained attention and effort. Yet the constant pressures of work, debt, and social expectation make such engagement difficult to maintain. Mass entertainment, consumer culture, and superficial forms of activism offer the illusion of participation or resistance without threatening the structural foundations of power. Ideology and distraction are mutually reinforcing. The narratives that justify hierarchy are more easily accepted when attention is divided and distraction is more tolerable. When framed within an ideological structure that promises personal advancement, eventual reward, or moral righteousness. Through these mechanisms, the ruling class achieves a form of control more profound than any army or police force could enforce, because it operates at the level of perception, belief, and attention. The oppressed consent to their own subjugation not because they are compelled, but because they are persuaded that no alternative exists, that struggle is futile, or that survival depends on compliance. Every political campaign, marketing strategy, and cultural production is oriented toward maintaining this equilibrium, ensuring that rebellion remains a distant abstraction rather than a concrete possibility. Historical evidence demonstrates the effectiveness of this system. The same structures that allow wealth accumulation and labor exploitation also reproduce ideology and distraction generation after generation, normalizing inequality and masking the mechanisms by which it is enforced. Even the most seemingly radical spaces are often co-opted into these processes. As ideas are commodified, dissent is packaged for consumption, and collective energy is redirected into channels that do not threaten the status quo. Yet, while ideology and distraction are powerful, they are not absolute. Consciousness, when cultivated, can pierce the veil of false necessity, exposing the relations of domination that underlie everyday life. Class consciousness, critical education, and deliberate attention to social reality reveal the artificiality of divisions, the mechanisms of control, and the exploitation that sustains the wealth of the few. When workers recognize that their labor creates all value, that the conditions of their oppression are neither natural nor inevitable, and that the ruling class depends on their distraction and ideological submission, the foundations of power become vulnerable. Organized reflection, discussion, and mobilization can transform awareness into action, turning the subtle control of ideology and distraction into a battlefield of consciousness. The struggle against the ruling class, therefore, is not only material but also intellectual, requiring the dismantling of the ideological frameworks and distractions that perpetuate submission, while simultaneously cultivating the clarity, solidarity, and energy necessary to reclaim autonomy, assert collective power, and challenge the legitimacy of domination. Class consciousness is the recognition by the working class that their conditions are not merely individual misfortunes, but the result of systemic exploitation, that their labor produces all value while others reap its benefit, and that their collective existence is bound by shared oppression. In a society structured by private ownership of the means of production, workers are dispersed, isolated, and alienated from one another, their labor compartmentalized, and their attention consumed by survival. This isolation is not a natural state. It is imposed and maintained deliberately to prevent solidarity to fragment potential resistance, and to ensure that each worker experiences struggle as personal rather than structural. Without class consciousness, each individual perceives their hardships as unique, their suffering as personal failure and their victories as individual merit. Such perceptions serve the ruling class by discouraging recognition of common interests and shared conditions, making collective action appear unnecessary or impossible. Yet, as workers begin to recognize the systemic nature of their exploitation, isolation begins to dissolve. Awareness that as labor is commodified, that surplus value is extracted to enrich a ruling minority, and that poverty, precarity, and insecurity are products of social organization rather than personal inadequacy, fosters an understanding of interconnected struggle. Class consciousness reframes experience. The hardships endured by one worker are not unique but reflective of a structural reality faced by all. Alienation, which once produced passivity and resignation, becomes a source of insight into the dynamics of domination, revealing the mechanisms through which wealth is accumulated, labor is exploited, and freedom is constrained. This awakening is transformative because it converts perception into relational awareness. Workers begin to see one another not as competitors or strangers, but as comrades bound by a shared condition, whose combined strength is capable of confronting the structures that enforce inequality. Communication, education, and dialogue among laborers amplify this understanding as collective discussion, reveals patterns of exploitation, identifies common interests, and fosters strategies for resistance. The fragmented individual begins to perceive themselves as part of a larger whole, whose collective potential far exceeds the sum of isolated effort. Class consciousness also transforms action, providing a framework through which isolated grievances coalesce into organized demands. Strikes, protests, unions, and social movements emerge from the recognition that systemic change cannot be achieved individually. The worker who once endured exploitation silently comes to understand that the power of many united is not only moral but material, that collective labor can disrupt production, challenge accumulation, and assert rights that are impossible to secure alone. Historical examples of labor movements, from early industrial strikes to modern organized campaigns, demonstrate the practical consequences of this transformation. When workers develop consciousness of shared conditions, they are able to coordinate action, negotiate with power on equal terms, and assert influence that challenges the interests of the ruling class. Moreover, class consciousness is not solely reactive. It fosters proactive imagination of alternative social arrangements. Awareness of exploitation allows workers to conceptualize societies in which production serves human need rather than private profit, in which labor is dignified rather than alienated, and in which resources are distributed according to collective benefit rather than ownership. This vision strengthens solidarity, providing a shared horizon toward which organized action can advance. The transformation from isolation to collective power is also psychological and cultural. Workers who recognize their common condition develop mutual support, empathy, and shared identity, counteracting the alienation imposed by competitive labor markets and ideological manipulation. Cultural forms, language, and narratives emerge from this shared awareness, reinforcing unity, fostering resilience, and sustaining morale in the face of repression or hardship. It is through this shared consciousness that fear and resignation can be replaced by confidence, that passivity can give way to agency, and that fragmented experience can be reconstructed into a coherent understanding of both oppression and potential. Class consciousness also exposes the mechanisms that sustain ruling class power. Workers become aware of how ideology, distraction, and institutional structures serve to perpetuate inequality and disempowerment. This awareness enables them to resist not only immediate forms of exploitation, but also the subtle means by which consent is manufactured, attention is diverted, and solidarity is undermined. Knowledge of these mechanisms strengthens strategic capacity, allowing the working class to coordinate, not merely for immediate relief, but for long-term transformation of social relations. In this way, class consciousness converts isolation, a condition imposed by capitalist social organization, into a source of strength, a catalyst for unity, and a foundation for collective power. By understanding shared conditions, identifying common interests, and organizing in solidarity, workers transcend the limitations of individual action and assume control over their collective destiny. Isolation, once a tool of oppression, is transformed into an arena for mutual recognition, strategic collaboration, and revolutionary potential, enabling the working class to assert influence, challenge domination, and advance towards systemic change. Revolutionary social transformation is not achieved through isolated acts of defiance, fleeting outrage, or individual moral awakening. It emerges from organized struggle, from the deliberate and sustained coordination of collective action aimed at dismantling oppressive structures and creating new forms of social relation. History demonstrates that spontaneous discontent, while necessary to awaken awareness, is insufficient to challenge entrenched power. The ruling class possesses not only material resources but also ideological influence, state apparatus, and the capacity to exploit division among the oppressed. Without organization, the energy of revolt is dissipated, co-opted, or crushed before it can effect systemic change. Organized struggle, by contrast, transforms dispersed grievances into focused action, providing structure, strategy, and coherence to the revolutionary impulse. It enables participants to recognize their shared interests, to coordinate efforts, and to apply pressure on the institutions that perpetuate inequality. Organization is both a defensive and offensive tool. It protects those who resist from repression, while amplifying their capacity to challenge entrenched power. In the absence of structure, individual acts of resistance are isolated and vulnerable, easily neutralized by superior force or undermined by social fragmentation. Organized struggle allows for the pooling of knowledge, resources, and capabilities, ensuring that revolutionary efforts are not merely reactive but proactive, capable of sustaining momentum and adapting to changing circumstances. Collective planning permits the identification of strategic targets, the development of alternative institutions, and the creation of alliances that can strengthen the movement. It also fosters discipline and commitment, preventing disillusionment or retreat when immediate results are not evident. Revolutionary transformation requires a fundamental reorganization of social, economic, and political relations, a process that cannot be achieved piecemeal or through superficial reforms. The capitalist system, built upon the exploitation of labor, concentration of wealth, and control ideology, is resilient precisely because it can absorb isolated challenges without altering its foundational structures. Only through coordinated struggle strikes, protests, education campaigns, mutual aid networks, political movements, and the creation of alternative structures can the working class confront the power of the ruling elite and assert collective agency. Organization also cultivates class consciousness, connecting individual understanding of exploitation to broader systemic realities. When workers come together in shared struggle, they not only amplify their material impact, but also deepen their awareness of the social and economic forces that shape their lives. This consciousness reinforces commitment, strengthens solidarity, and provides the moral and intellectual foundation for sustained revolutionary effort. Moreover, organized struggle enables the oppressed to challenge both the visible and invisible mechanisms of power. It confronts not only economic exploitation but also the ideological, cultural, and institutional practices that maintain dominance. Through coordinated action, the working class can resist co-optation, disrupt the reproduction of inequality, and begin constructing alternative social relations that prioritize collective welfare over private accumulation. Organization also transforms potential energy into strategic power. A single worker striking or protesting may be dismissed, arrested, or ignored. But when thousands act in unison, the system experiences real disruption. Production halts, resources are redirected, and political attention is compelled to respond. This concentration of force, rooted in deliberate planning and collective discipline, is the material basis of revolutionary leverage. Sustained struggle requires mechanisms for communication, leadership, and accountability, ensuring that actions are coherent, goals are clear, and resources are efficiently deployed. It necessitates the creation of networks that can endure repression, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain momentum over time. Revolutionary organization is therefore both pragmatic and ideological. It is designed to maximize effectiveness in confronting power, while also cultivating the collective consciousness and moral clarity necessary to envision a transformed society. Furthermore, organized struggle is essential to prevent recuperation or co-optation by the ruling class. Capitalist systems have historically absorbed spontaneous resistance, offering superficial reforms, symbolic concessions, or co-opted leadership to neutralize threats. Only a disciplined, coordinated, and conscious movement can maintain pressure, resist co-optation, and ensure that gains are structural rather than cosmetic. It is through sustained organization that the working class can move from reactive protest to proactive creation, laying the groundwork for institutions, governance structures, and economic arrangements that reflect the collective interest rather than private accumulation. Organization also cultivates resilience. Revolutionary struggle is rarely linear. It encounters setbacks, repression, and internal conflict. Collective structures provide the support necessary to endure these challenges, to learn from mistakes, and to adapt strategy without losing cohesion. Solidarity becomes both a practical and moral resource, reinforcing commitment and sustaining the movement through adversity. In essence, organized struggle transforms dispersed dissatisfaction into directed action, latent power into tangible leverage, and fragmented awareness into shared consciousness. It is the vehicle through which the oppressed can confront systemic exploitation, disrupt entrenched hierarchies, and construct a society oriented toward justice, equality, and human dignity. Without organization, the revolutionary impulse remains vulnerable to fragmentation, co-optation, and defeat. With it, the working class becomes a coherent, disciplined, and capable agent of social transformation, capable of reshaping not only immediate conditions, but the fundamental structures that govern human life. In conclusion, the world does not fear your busyness, your exhaustion, or your compliance. It fears your awareness, your unity, and your organized action. Capitalism thrives by keeping you preoccupied, distracted, and divided, extracting value from your labor while convincing you that your struggles are personal and inevitable. Ideology teaches you to accept inequality as natural, and the pressures of daily life ensure that reflection and solidarity remain luxuries few can afford. Yet when workers awaken to their shared condition, when class consciousness transforms isolation into collective power, the foundations of oppression are revealed, and the potential for systemic change becomes real. Organized struggle is not optional, it is the engine through which revolutionary transformation occurs, turning dispersed energy into focused, strategic, and unstoppable force. The laboring class creates all value, yet only through consciousness, unity, and deliberate action can it reclaim control over its own life and reshape society according to principles of justice, dignity, and human need. Awareness must lead to organization, and organization must lead to action. For it is in this triad that true liberation is forged, and the old world of exploitation begins to crumble.